Oleksandr Kalnychenko at the moment works at Translation Studies of Mikola Lukács, Translation Studies Department at Karazin National University in Kharkiv, Ukraine. He's also teaching and researching at the Matibel University in Banska Bystrica. His main focus lies in translation history, and especially, I would say, ideological and political aspects of translation history. So it seems to me. Today he's going to talk about changing translation methods and erasing translation theory in Ukraine in the 1930s. And I have to tell you that I was quite surprised when I learned from you that actually translators' political point of view or their political stance may influence their method, translation method, and their approach toward the text. So I'm quite curious to hear more about that. And now I would like to give floor to you, please.
Yes, thank you. Let us change the places. Yeah. And yes, Martin, yes, please follow the time and make me signs.
Yes, I have a stop.
Yeah, this one. So I'm going to speak about, yes, first of all, esteemed colleagues, I'd like to express my gratitude for the possibility to talk here. Especially, I'm very grateful for that opportunity to speak here where such outstanding, in my opinion, scholars in the field of Slovak and Ukrainian relations work. I mean, Mikuláš Nerli, certainly, and Mikhail Molnar, whose work I highly appreciate. Yes, I don't know how shall I call them, Czech, Slovaks, or Ukrainian scholars. I believe they are all that. Yes, and certainly I'd like to express my gratitude to Slovakia, and to Maria Kusa, to Martin Jovcic, and all the Slovaks who were very helpful in my life this time. So this talk aims to consider broader social implications of translation policy fluctuation in Soviet Ukraine during the 1920s, 1930s. I'd like to prove, at least I'd like to show the mechanism of the state interference into the translation policy. And I'd like to show that how translation policy may help building up totalitarianism. Yes, I'd like to start with an epigraph. 2 years ago, I used it, and in my opinion, possibly Eliot was one of the first, possibly Ivan Bagriani, who told that. Yes, for example, Bagriani, 23 years before Solzhenitsyn described everything that was described in Archipelago Gulag in his Tigrolove, Tiger Hunters. So the Russians have been the first modern people to practice the political direction of culture consciously and to attack at every point the culture of any people whom they wish to dominate. So that is 1948, Eliot. And one more epigraph. So I'd like to say that last week appeared this book, The Routledge Handbook of the History of Translation Studies, edited by Anna Lange, Daniele Monticelli, and Christopher Randall. And there's a chapter which we wrote together with Lada about translation studies. Yes, in fact, the chapter, it was Zuzana Yetmarova who started it, but she hasn't completed, and we did that. So, and I'm very grateful for that to Martin Jovcic, who helped us to write about Popovich and about Levy, and so about Slovaks and about Czechs. Once again, Martin, thank you very much indeed. And I was taken aback. These words are not mine, but in annotation to that book, you can read, the volume also traces institutionalization of translation and interpreting studies and its key concept from their beginning in the 1920s in Ukraine. So I believe that is the appreciation of those scholars who worked at that time in the 1920s, 1930s, about whom I'm going to speak. Yes, and an outline. First of all, I'd like to speak about the upsurge of translation matter in Ukraine in the 1920s, very briefly. So, Grigory Kochur, a prominent Ukrainian translator and translation history scholar, he divided Ukrainian translation tradition into periods, and the periods from 1917 to about 1932 is characterized by great enthusiasm and upsurge in translation activities. When hundreds of translations from dozens of languages, both living and dead ones, were being brought out, then one more feature, the appearance of multi-volume collections of translated authors, like Guy Maupassant, Jack London, 27 volumes, yes, Anatole France, Émile Zola, Mykola Gogol, Anton Chekhov, Heinrich Heine, so they appeared at that time. And so what is more important even, that in the 1960s, so at the very end of Khrushchev's thaw, those translations were a bit modernized and republished. It was the second wave of mass retranslations. It was very important, in my opinion, because the best translators of that time, Yuri Lisniak, for example, or Mykola Lukash, they participated in editing of those translations of the 1920s. And the last thing, that is the boost in the development of translation theory. So when Grigory Kochur wrote that, he couldn't mention the names of Derzhavin, Zerov he could, Filipovich, Burkhard Mayfeld, yes. Just a second, please. Oh, yes, you got all right. The entire screen, not just the slides. So I'd like to add that the pinnacle of this translation boom yes. It's impossible to move. No? Thank you. Okay, so
okay, just takes
let it be the next slide. So I'd like to say that the pinnacle of this translation boom occurred during the late 1920s and early 1930s. And since publishing houses paid royalties at that time, so dozens of talented writers actively engaged in translation work. That is very important, in my opinion. In addition, during this period, as I've said, translation studies appeared, as well as the word for it, перекладознавство, literary translation studies, which documented in the syllabi of Mykola Zerov and Mikhailo Kalinovich in their syllabi on translation theory for the Ukrainian Institute of Linguistic Education, opened in 1930 and designed to train translators of literature and in technology and teachers of foreign literatures. So that possibly that was the first institution ever at the university level. So possibly that was one of the steps in the institutionalization, very important, of translation studies, because the discipline became didactic at the same time. Yes, and Oleksandr Finkel published first Eastern Europe's monograph on translation, теорії і практика перекладу, yes, which could be used as a manual at that time. Yes, and in 1929, Alexander Biletsky, who, by the way, was the chair, was the head of the literature, world literature research department in Kharkiv University, where Finkel worked, where Mayfet worked, where Derzhavin worked, so he was their head. So he said, the views on the artistic value of translations into Ukrainian had changed radically by that time. Whereas quite recently, a reader would wonder at the pointless waste of means and effort which they saw in translating the world classics into Ukrainian, whose works could well be read in Russian, and whereas the very feasibility of rendering the masterpieces of the world literature by means of the commonplace and humble Ukrainian language seemed futile as early as in 1928, 1929, the emergence of numerous undoubtedly valuable translations compelled that very reader to admit how very wrong he or she was. So Ukrainian language and Ukrainian translations proved to be at the level. So now, the second point of my lecture is a raised discussion on homologous or analogous translation method in Ukraine in 1927, in 1931. So then discussion was stopped. And its members mostly disappeared. So it was Derzhavin who triggered it. In 1927, so the discussion was around the essence of translation, whether it should be an analogy or stylization of the original. So if you would like to use today's term, whether it should be foreignizing or domesticating. So in 1927, he wrote and published an article, Проблема віршованого перекладу, The Problem of Verse Translation. Volodymyr Державин advocates the production of the properties of the original, of the source, on the principal basis of translation sterilization. Otherwise, it was called homologous translation or philologically accurate translation. So when translator is trying to render, first of all, the style of the original, so that is focused on the original text. Translation focused on the original text. Oleksandr Finkel defends translation analogy, and in fact, his book, Teórie и практика перекладу, this book is in fact written against his friend, against the opinions of his friend, close friend, Volodymyr Державин, to whom he, by the way, devoted this book. Different positions. So it's interesting that is an example of Scopus theory in this paper. Yes. So the main idea in Державин, in my opinion, in Державин is just the definition of this approach. It's necessary, first of all, to admit that literary translation, sterilization translation, should be if possible, thank you. I can't see. Not in the sense that every word of the source text should be translated separately, but in the sense that the artistic value of every sentence, word, grammatical or phonetic structure of the source should, if possible, be embodied in the style of translation. So that was his main demand. So possibly this definition is even better. So this is not from that paper, but this is from his review on translation of Gogol, about whom Lada spoke. And okay, I will speak as well. A truly artistic translation can only be a stylized one. That is, such a translation that seeks to convey not only the content aspect of the work, even if in all to the finest subtlety, but also the stylistic aspect. That is, the artistic peculiarities of the language. For this purpose, the translator has a right to depart from the correct language, literal language, the generally accepted norm, and whenever he or she can, use the less standard stylistic variants, including archaic ones. This stance, by the way, was supported by Mykola Zerov. Just a short piece, a short citation. When translated Hugo, one can't get past his spectacular syntax, his brilliant oratory. There cannot be an elementary, decent translation of Verlaine without maximum attention to his phonetic devices. And the translator of Verhaeren would hand down his own death sentence, having lost in his work the rich metaphoricity, characteristics of the poet's French text. So the core, what is to be translated, that is the core, in his opinion. Parallel to this, an alternative approach was imagined. Yes, and I must admit that it was predominantly in the Communist Party milieu, one which focused not on the source text, but on the mass Soviet reader, so which allowed for changes, omissions, and additions. So especially in relation to the so-called class injurious literature. So that is the literature of the writers from the West, not communist and not progressive writers. The adept, the champion of this position was Ivan Kulik. Ivan Kulik was an important In fact, he represented Soviet power in Ukraine. Before that, he was a consul and ambassador in Canada. He was very important Bolshevik, and he was the first who headed the Ukrainian Union of Writers in 1934, when it is formed in the wake of the old Union of Writers. So he said, in his foreword to his brilliant work, An Anthology of American Poetry, he knew personally, for example, Sandberg and Gold, for example. He translated Whitman, Sandberg, contemporary American poets. So he said, we have sometimes made deliberate attempts to adapt translation to the understanding and perception of them by the audience for which the book is intended. We had in mind that we were translating for a Ukrainian reader, a modern Soviet one at that. This forced us to make some deliberate changes in our translation compared to the originals. And in other piece, he added, poems by American poets accurately translated would have one meaning in New York and the other in Kharkiv. So now I'm going to speak few words about Gogol's style and about the book Lada was speaking. Yes, about the translations of Gogol made in 1929 and 1930, and then in a decade when the approach was quite different. I'd like just to show the linguistics of that, the examples, language examples. But first of all, the characteristics of Gogol's style. Yes, despite the fact that Nikolai Gogol was, first of all, I'd like, despite the fact that Gogol wrote in Russian, his literary language, motifs, images, and themes are rooted in his native Ukrainian soil. So a feature of Gogol's language was the ability to skillfully mix Russian and Ukrainian, high style and jargon, count. So, and now I'd like, I've never read about that, but I'd like to say that in translation studies, it's normally assumed that readers of a translated text possesses less background knowledge than those reading the original source. So the readers of the original, it is assumed, are always know more than the readers of the translation. For instance, English translations of Gogol's Taras Bulba, for example, typically expect readers to have less context than readers of the original work, the Russians. But let us think about Gogol's translations into Ukrainian. Who knows more about Ukrainian culture, about Ukrainian realities, who understands Ukrainianism, Russians or Ukrainians? So that is the situation. Maybe not very often, but there are situations when the average reader can know of the translation, can know more than the average reader of the original. So, and now I'd like to speak, yes. So, the translator whose readers know more, he is expected to take into account that fact and make changes. Otherwise, everybody would laugh reading that nonsense. Just an example. It's an example from Russian translation. Yes, in fact, that is the mistake of Scott Fitzgerald. The chauffeur, a Russian Tsar of the period of Ivan the Terrible. So every Russian or even every Slovak would laugh at that, because we all know that there was only one Tsar during the period of Ivan the Terrible himself. So the translator had to do something, and, for example, Kalashnikova rendered it chauffeur, настоящий русский боярин времен Ивана Грозного. То есть a big beard, etc. So, and we know the pictures of Ivan the Terrible with very scarce beard. So, Edita Boyanovska, about modern American writer who wrote a book about Gogol. Yes, her appreciation of Gogol's style. The Russian of his works on Ukrainian themes, however, is so Ukrainized, she meant certainly the early Ukrainian tales, as to be barely readable without a Ukrainian dictionary. Gogol supplied his own glossaries to his early stories, similar to the Scottish glossaries that accompany Sir Walter Scott's fiction. Understandably, any translation implies certain deviations from the original, but the losses sustained are inevitable. In the Gogol's case, however, they are especially painful, as they are fraught with the obliteration of the unique Russo-Ukrainian language dichotomy of that stylistic medley, inherent of Gogol's style, hence standardization of Gogol's idiom, dialect. And again, paradoxical as it may sound, the loss of the Ukrainian constituent as the aesthetic function of the latter is manifested only through the conceptual counterpoint with the Russian constituent of the language dichotomy. Or as Robert Romanchuk, modern American writer, wrote, so Gogol never ceased writing Ukrainian, in Russian. Pardon? I'd like to... It's very important to, first of all, to use, but I do not have here. I'd like to cite Andrei Belый, who in Мастерство Гоголя, the book Мастерство Гоголя, in which he said that herein are incorporated high-toned bureaucratic diction, which Gogol had some time to study both in Nizhyn and in St. Petersburg. Technical languages, the parlance of the kitchen, of landlords, of wallets, hunters, and gamblers, and the language of bourgeoisie and artisans. From this hectic medley, Gogol concocts an idiom of his own. Those Russism, Ukrainism, and Polonism at times turn into grammar which is not justifiable, but any grammar. This vivid mass by 3/4 was then destined to make Russian belles-lettres style itself, and even more so. Changes the very language in which he himself sometimes felt as a foreigner. So this paradox of Gogol's idiom explains the age-old translation problem associated with translating Gogol into Ukrainian. So now I'd like to show you some, the translation of genius, translators. So that is 5-volume edition of the collective works, which hasn't appeared, in fact, but only 3. It was truncated, this collection. Only 3 of them appeared, and I'd like to discuss two of them, yes, where the translators tried to preserve the style of this dichotomy of Russian and Ukrainian. So they used modern Ukrainian and archaic Ukrainian. That was an attempt to render this exotism of the style, to make style exotic. So that was the way out. It was a great finding. So Derzhavin called this translation as one of the first genially stylizing translation. And so first of all, the translators used the words from the diaries of the Gogol's time, from the works of Vasily Gogol, his father, who wrote in Ukrainian dramas. So the letters of that time. So they tried to use the words that were used at that time and not to use modernized words. Yes, for example, they use such words as заручений, ферт, люлька з месянжевою правою, all characteristic of the Gogol time. Particularly difficult was the translation of Taras Bulba, because it's a Ukrainian epic style. So the dichotomy of Russian-Ukrainian speech, as I've said, was conveyed through the dichotomy of the contemporary Ukrainian language versus the elements of archaic or dialectal Ukrainian. I'd like just to show you the texts. Гоголь. Берестовые скамьи вокруг всей комнаты, огромный стол, под образами в парадном углу, широкая печь с запечьями, уступами и выступами. Части, the parts of the stove. Покрытая цветными пестрыми изразцами. Все это было очень знакомо нашим двум молодцам, приходившим каждый год домой на каникулярное время, etc. Just and now, Андрей Никовский translation. Берестові лави кругом усієї хати, великий стіл під образами у покуті, широка піч із запічками, карунками і прискалками. So he uses old words. Instead of the words contemporary to Gogol, he used old Ukrainian words. And then, for example, викладена колірним ярним кахлем. Again, he used archaic words. And, for example, на час вакаційний. It was traditional vacatio. Latin was used in that sense, etc. So one more example. Just все собрались в кружок, и после третьего боя в барабаны, да, показались, наконец, старшины, кошевой с палицей в руке, знаком своего достоинства, судья с войсковой печатью, писарь с чернильницей и Исаул с жезлом. Никовский translates. Виступили старшина і кошовий з патерницею. So instead of abstract word, he specifies. He uses the word, how it was called in the 16th century, this sign of dignity of this person. So, знак його гідності. Суддя з перчаткою військовою, the change of word order, archaism, писар з каламарем і осовула з пірначем. So, пірнач against the symbol of a soul. The very concrete, very specific word. So that is a way how achieved this exorcism. So because more than 5 minutes. Oh, okay. Another translation, not by Nikovsky, by Zerov. Zerov translated Ivan Fedorovich Shponka and his auntie. Ivan Fedorovich Shponka та їх тітенька. Not его, but их, theirs, as it was, as they used to say. So he used polite forms as "мостивий пане," for example, Ukrainian "шановний," "пані матка померли." So to speak about parents in plural, an old form, etc. So that was the way how to make Gogol's language exotic. So campaign against nationalist saboteurs. In fact, I described that and I published those documents. So a few words about Soviet censorship. Soviet state apparatus, so practice of dual control over all publications, ascending from the bottom up in the hierarchical position. Press censorship in the preparation for the publication stage. So there was a self-censorship, editorial control in publishing houses and print media, preliminary control by the authorities from Golovlit, that is the main department for literature and publishing, so which did not exist as they used to say, but it did. Yes, and the subsequent censorship, so the censorship after, for almost the entire duration of the book's existence in public use. So control of the layout, or the control by the Soviet secret police agencies at the level of published works. And then one more plane of control, that is controlled by ideological departments of the Central Committee and regional committees of the party, so by the sectors of ideology. They were to be Russians. That was obligatory. The second so the first secretary, that is local. The second secretary, responsible for ideology, must be Russian. That was obligatory, which could exercise both types of the control. So this top-down Soviet censorship policy was on not only on ideological, but it was also on linguistic level. No, yes, very important fact. In 1930, all private and cooperative publishing houses in Ukraine were liquidated. So only state. The state became the sole commissioner of translators, as well as the sole owner and distributor of the resources, so money, premises, paper, equipment, materials, everything belongs to the state. With the centralization of Ukrainian publishing houses, a centralized state commission was introduced, which involved the formation of a unified list of authors and titles of foreign works for translation, approved by the censor, including recommended circulations for various translated publications. So then appeared the long list of the banned authors, of the banned works. So this period is the period of decline in translation activities. And now, so we can speak about 3 waves of mass repressions against Ukrainian intellectuals. Yes, and this campaign, Lada spoke about it in few words, so I will omit it, that the campaign triggered plentiful relay translations, as well as retranslations and revisions. So this period witnessed numerous condemning pogrom publications in press. So here are examples. And so in this period, translation from Russian occupied the dominant position, and Lada cited Daniele Monticelli. And what is important, they serve as a model for the generation of new original Ukrainian works in accordance with the canon of socialist realism. So Soviet literature written in the Ukrainian language, I would call it like that. So different Le, Bash, those authors, so they copied the Russian examples. So all ages in the translation process, translators, censors, publishers, commissioners, editors, critics, so all they turn into one pool, into one batch, which has strictly defined goals. And what is important, Stalin's regime attempt to openly regulate literary expression. So it was, yes, so this campaign in press, and not only in press, but on those, possibly people of my age, they remember those trade union meetings, for example. So regime attempt to openly regulate literary expression. So not only the text which are to be translated, it's quite clear, but the method itself. So now they select the second method. Yes, then the orthography. To bring the Ukrainian language closer to Russian, the first Soviet orthography of the Ukrainian language, so-called Kharkiv orthography, Kharkivsky pravopis, which was a synthesis of both the Eastern Central and Western Ukrainian vernacular traditions, approved in 1928, was reformed, was changed in 5 years. The purpose of the work was generally defined as the elimination of nationalist spelling rules that oriented the Ukrainian language to Polish and Czech bourgeois circles. So, because this orthography, it was said, placed a barrier between the Ukrainian and Russian languages. So they began to develop a notorious translationese. So the vocabularies of the republished of the new retranslations, revisions or retranslations were purged of archaisms, which harked back to national history, and aligned elements, e.g., for example, vocabulary of Polish or German origin, which were dubbed fascist. The prohibited words and other elements were replaced by internationalist ones. So Russian-derived modern vocabulary and grammar constructions borrowed from Russian. And translation was to play a dominant role. Mass retranslation and revision. So here is translation by Anton Khutaryan under his editorship, the whole volume, but Khutaryan's translation was done in 1935, just 5 years after the previous translation by Nikovsky, I mean Gogol, for example. Just let us compare. Кошевой с палицей в руке. Кошовий с палицею в руці. For example, Єсаул з жезлом. Осавул з жезлом. So, 1-to-1. So, how do you think? Which is closer to Gogol? 10 years ago, I suggested both translations to 10 professors and to 10 postgraduate students. So all the professors selected the first one as the better, appreciated it as better. All postgraduate students, but one, selected the second, this one. They considered it better. It was more understandable. And just to demonstrate to you that not only from Russian language, here is examples from Gates, they get fly. And the translation by Maria Lysichenko, 1929, by Maria Ryabova, 1935, that is the new translation. And just to compare with Russian, the Russian translation by Natalia Volzhina, 1958. So you can say that Ryabova borrowed from Volzhina. And I'm certain that Volzhina didn't take from Ryabova. But let us compare. The first translation. Артур сидів у книгозбірні, Артур сидів в бібліотеці, Артур сидів в бібліотеці. Отець ректор, канонік Монтанелі, урвавши на мить своє писання, поглянув з любов'ю на чорняву голову. Ну і так далі. You can see, here you can see that the second translation coincides with the Russian translation. Though it was not done from the Russian. It was the work of the editors. It was the new requirements just to make the languages closer. So, and at the very end, I'd like to, yes. Pardon?
From which,
The Get Fly by Etel Lilian Voynich, that was one of the very important for Soviet canon book. The Get Fly, Irish writer, Etel Lilian Voynich. Yes, you are welcome. And instead of conclusion, the communists fighting with the Ukrainian translation school was an important part of the broader strategy of provincializing the Ukrainian literature and weakening the Ukrainian language until it reaches the level of oceanness. Thank you.